Sit, Alexander said, gesturing to a chair near his desk. Ethan obeyed, sinking into the plush seat. He watched as Alexander moved to his desk, his fingers flying across a sleek keyboard. "What are you doing?" Ethan asked cautiously. "Pulling up the security footage," Alexander replied. "If this guy was watching me, then he might have been caught on one of the cameras near my building." Ethan nodded, though he wasn't sure how much help the footage would be. He leaned back in the chair, his gaze drifting to the window. For the first time in weeks, he felt warm, safe. But that feeling was fleeting, overshadowed by the weight of the situation he had stumbled into. "You're not telling me everything, are you?" Alexander's voice broke through Ethan's thoughts, sharp and probing. Ethan's head snapped around, his stomach twisting with anxiety. "I told you what I saw," he said quickly. "That's not what I mean," Alexander replied, his eyes narrowing. "There's more to this. I can see it in the way you're acting. If you want my help, you need to be honest with me." Ethan swallowed hard, his mind racing. He had secrets, ones he wasn't ready to share, but Alexander was right. If he wanted to survive whatever came next, he couldn't do it alone. Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his seat, the plush comfort of the chair doing little to ease his nerves. Alexander's intense gaze felt like it was peeling back the layers of his guarded soul, searching for truths he wasn't ready to share. He stared at his hands, the grime of the streets still etched into his nails, a sharp contrast to the immaculate desk before him. How had he gone from hiding in alleyways to sitting in the office of one of the most powerful men in the city? "I'm not hiding anything," Ethan mumbled, though the tremor in his voice betrayed him. Alexander didn't look convinced. He leaned back in his chair, studying the boy like a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the faint hum of the city below. "You may think you're protecting yourself," Alexander said finally, his tone softer now but no less firm. "But if you know something, anything, that could help me figure out who's behind this, you need to tell me. Not just for my sake, but for yours." Ethan's stomach twisted. He wanted to trust Alexander, but trust was a dangerous gamble, one he'd lost too many times before. "I don't know anything else," he said, forcing himself to meet Alexander's eyes. "I swear." Before Alexander could respond, his phone buzzed on the desk. He glanced at the screen, his expression darkening as he read the message. "They found something," he said, more to himself than to Ethan. His fingers moved quickly over the keyboard, pulling up the footage his security team had sent. Ethan leaned forward, his curiosity outweighing his fear. The screen filled with grainy black and white footage of a street corner not far from where Alexander's car had been parked earlier that evening. A man in a black hoodie appeared on the screen, his face obscured by the shadow of his hood. He moved quickly, his head darting back and forth as if checking for pursuers. In his hand was a small, unmarked bag. "There," Ethan said, pointing at the screen. "That's him." Alexander nodded, his jaw tightening as he studied the footage. "Zoom in," he muttered to himself, manipulating the controls to get a closer look at the man's face. But the hoodie cast a deep shadow, making it impossible to make out any defining features. Frustration flickered across Alexander's face. "Who are you?" he whispered under his breath. Ethan's eyes flicked to the timestamp on the footage. "Wait," he said suddenly. "Go back a few seconds." Alexander frowned but did as Ethan asked, rewinding the footage. Ethan squinted at the screen, his brow furrowing in concentration. "There," he said, pointing again. "See his wrist? When he adjusts the bag, you can see something." Alexander paused the video and zoomed in on the man's wrist. Sure enough, a small tattoo peeked out from under the sleeve of his hoodie. It was faint, barely visible, but unmistakable. A jagged symbol that looked like a combination of a lightning bolt and a snake. "Do you recognize that?" Ethan asked, his voice trembling slightly. Alexander didn't answer immediately. He stared at the screen, his mind racing. The symbol was familiar, though he couldn't place where he'd seen it before. But one thing was clear, this wasn't a random attack. Whoever was behind this had planned it carefully, leaving just enough clues to taunt him without giving away their identity. "I've seen it before," Alexander said finally, his tone grim. "But I can't remember where." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. The more he learned about this situation, the more dangerous it seemed. "What do we do now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Alexander didn't answer right away. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled under his chin as he thought. "We find out who that man is," he said, "and we figure out why he wants me dead." The weight of his words hung heavy in the air. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he was in way over his head. He had spent his life avoiding trouble, staying in the shadows where it was safe. But now, he was caught in a web of intrigue and danger, with no clear way out. "I need you to think, Ethan," Alexander said, pulling the boy from his thoughts. "Are you sure you've never seen that symbol before? Maybe on the streets, on someone's jacket, or a building?" Ethan shook his head. "I don't think so," he said. "But there's a place I could check." Alexander raised an eyebrow. "What place?" Ethan hesitated. "There's a guy I know," he said finally. "He's kind of like a broker. He knows things. Who's in charge of what, where to go if you need something. If anyone would recognize that symbol, it's him." Alexander nodded slowly. "All right, take me to him." Ethan's eyes widened. "Take you? No offense, but you don't exactly blend in. If he sees someone like you with me, he won't talk." Alexander frowned but didn't argue. "Fine," he said. "But you're not going alone. I'll have one of my men go with you." Ethan started to protest but stopped himself. He didn't want to admit it, but the idea of having backup was reassuring. "Okay," he said reluctantly, "but they can't look like, security." "I'll handle it," Alexander said. He picked up his phone and made a quick call, issuing instructions in a low, authoritative tone. When he hung up, he turned back to Ethan. "You'll leave in the morning. For now, you stay here." Ethan blinked. "Here? In this office?" Alexander smirked faintly. "Not here. I have a guest suite on the next floor. You'll be safe there." Safe. The word felt foreign to Ethan, almost laughable. But as he followed Alexander's assistant to the suite, he couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he had finally found someone who could help him. Someone who wouldn't let him fall through the cracks. But as he lay in the unfamiliar comfort of the guest bed that night, staring at the ceiling, a nagging thought wouldn't leave him. The man in the hoodie hadn't just been targeting Alexander. He had been watching Ethan too, as if he knew something Ethan didn't. And that terrified him. The early morning sun filtered through the heavy curtains of the guest suite, but Ethan had hardly slept. His mind raced with questions he couldn't answer, scenarios he couldn't prepare for. The memory of the hooded figure haunted him, the faint outline of the tattoo etched in his mind. Who was this man? And why did Ethan feel like he was part of something far bigger and more dangerous than he'd ever imagined? A knock at the door snapped Ethan out of his thoughts. He opened it to find a tall man with a wiry frame and sharp eyes. Dressed casually in a faded jacket and jeans, he didn't look like security, but there was an unmistakable air of alertness about him. "Name's Jackson," the man said, extending a hand. "Alexander sent me. You ready to go?" Ethan nodded, though his stomach churned with nerves. He grabbed his tattered hoodie and followed Jackson down a back stairwell to a discreet car waiting in the alley. The drive was tense and silent, the weight of their mission hanging heavy in the air. They pulled up near a dilapidated warehouse on the outskirts of the city. The place reeked of neglect, its walls covered in graffiti and its windows cracked or boarded up. Ethan hesitated before stepping out of the car, the familiar unease of his old life settling over him like a second skin. "Your contact's in there?" Jackson asked, eyeing the building. Ethan nodded. "Yeah. His name's Mick. Just let me do the talking." Jackson grunted in agreement but stayed close as Ethan led the way inside. The air inside the warehouse was thick with the smell of oil and rust, and the faint hum of machinery echoed in the distance. They found Mick hunched over a workbench, tinkering with the insides of a busted radio. He was a wiry man with a mop of unkempt hair and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "Mick," Ethan said, his voice steady but quiet. The man looked up, a grin spreading across his face when he saw Ethan. Well, if it isn't the kid who never stays out of trouble. What brings you here?" Ethan pulled out his phone and showed Mick a screenshot of the tattoo from the security footage. "Do you recognize this?" Mick's grin faltered. He squinted at the image, his expression turning serious. "Where'd you see this?" "That's not important," Ethan said quickly. "Do you know what it means?" Mick set down his tools and leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "That symbol belongs to a group you don't want to mess with. They call themselves the Black Vipers. Nasty bunch. Smuggling, extortion, you name it. They're in it. And they don't like people poking around their business." Ethan's heart sank. The name alone sent a shiver down his spine. He glanced at Jackson, whose jaw had tightened. "Why would they be after someone like Alexander?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mick shrugged. "Could be anything. Maybe he got in their way. Maybe he knows something they don't want him to. Or," he paused, his gaze shifting to Ethan, "maybe it's not him they're after." Ethan froze. "What do you mean? You said you saw this guy, right? Up close?" Mick's eyes narrowed. "Did he say anything to you? Do anything that seemed personal?" Ethan thought back to the moment the hooded man had shouted at him. The urgency in his voice, the way he'd locked eyes with Ethan. It hadn't just been about the food or Alexander. It had felt directed at him. But why? Before Ethan could answer, the sound of footsteps echoed through the warehouse. Jackson's hand darted to the inside of his jacket, and Mick's face darkened. "Were you followed?" Mick hissed. Ethan shook his head, panic rising in his chest. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by the faint creak of metal. Jackson motioned for Ethan to stay behind him as he moved toward the source of the noise. "Stay here," Jackson whispered. "Don't move." Ethan's instincts screamed at him to run, but his feet refused to obey. He crouched behind a stack of crates, his heart hammering in his chest. Mick grabbed a rusted pipe from the workbench, his knuckles white as he gripped it tightly. The warehouse fell silent, the kind of silence that presses on your ears and makes every breath sound too loud. Then, without warning, a shadow moved at the edge of Ethan's vision. He barely had time to react before a figure stepped into the dim light, their face hidden under a hood. It was him, the man from the footage. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The man's gaze swept the room, landing briefly on Mick before locking onto Ethan. His eyes were sharp and unyielding, and for a moment, the world seemed to stand still. "You," the man said, his voice low and rough, "you need to come with me." Ethan shook his head, his legs trembling. "I'm not going anywhere with you." The man took a step closer, his movements deliberate and unhurried. "You don't understand," he said. "You're in danger. They're coming for you." "Who's coming?" Jackson's voice cut through the tension like a knife. He stepped into view, his gun trained on the hooded man. The man didn't flinch. "You think that's going to stop them," he said, a grim smile tugging at his lips. "You have no idea what you're dealing with." "Try me," Jackson growled. Before anyone could react, a deafening crash echoed through the warehouse. The windows shattered as figures in dark clothing burst inside, their faces obscured by masks. Chaos erupted, and Ethan barely had time to dive behind the crates before bullets ricocheted off the metal walls. Jackson fired back, his movements swift and precise. Mick swung his pipe at the nearest attacker, the clang of metal against metal ringing out. Ethan's mind raced as he tried to make sense of the chaos. Who were these people? And why were they after him? Amid the chaos, the hooded man grabbed Ethan's arm, pulling him to his feet. "If you want to survive," he said, his voice urgent, "you need to trust me." Ethan hesitated, fear and doubt warring within him. But as more masked figures closed in, he realized he didn't have a choice. He followed the man, his heart pounding as they sprinted toward an exit. The fight raged on behind them, but Ethan barely noticed. All he could think about was the man's words and the chilling realization that whatever danger Alexander was facing, it was now his danger too. Ethan's feet pounded against the pavement as he followed the hooded man into the cold night air. The warehouse was now a cacophony of shouts, gunfire, and the occasional clash of metal. The hooded man led him down a narrow alley, his movements swift and calculated, as though he had mapped out every escape route in advance. Ethan's lungs burned, his mind racing with questions, but there was no time to stop, no time to process. After what felt like an eternity, they reached a small, unmarked van parked at the end of the alley. The man threw open the side door and motioned for Ethan to get inside. Hesitation flickered in Ethan's mind, but the urgency in the man's eyes left no room for debate. He climbed in, and the man followed, slamming the door shut behind them. The van roared to life, and Ethan realized someone else was in the driver's seat. A woman, her face partially obscured by the shadows, glanced back at them. "You got him?" she asked, her voice steady but sharp. "Barely," the hooded man replied. "Drive. Now." The van sped off, leaving the chaos of the warehouse behind. Ethan sat in silence, gripping the edge of the seat as his breathing gradually slowed. The hooded man pulled off his mask, revealing a rugged face marked by years of hardship. His eyes, however, were sharp and calculating. "Who are you?" Ethan finally managed to ask, his voice trembling. "My name's Cole," the man said simply. "I'm with a group that's been tracking the Black Vipers for years. You're lucky I found you when I did." Ethan frowned, his mind struggling to piece everything together. "Tracking them? Why? And what do they want with me?" Cole exchanged a look with the driver before turning back to Ethan. "It's not just you. It's what you know." "What I know?" Ethan's confusion deepened. "I don't know anything about them." Cole's jaw tightened. "Not directly, maybe, but your connection to Alexander puts you in the middle of something dangerous. He's not just a billionaire with a big heart, Ethan. He's been funding covert operations against groups like the Vipers for years. You think all that philanthropy is just about helping people. It's about taking power away from the ones who exploit the vulnerable." Ethan's stomach churned. The man who had offered him a meal, a warm place to sleep, and a glimmer of hope was hiding a secret life, but it still didn't explain why the Vipers had targeted him. "Alexander's enemies don't just want to hurt him," Cole continued. "They want to send a message. And what better way to do that than by targeting the one thing he values most right now, his promise to protect you." The weight of Cole's words sank in, and Ethan's chest tightened. He wasn't just a homeless kid who got caught up in someone else's battle. He was leverage, a pawn in a game far more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. The van jolted suddenly, pulling Ethan from his thoughts. He looked out the window and realized they were heading out of the city. The skyscrapers and neon lights had given way to winding roads and dense forests. "Where are we going?" he asked, panic creeping into his voice. "Somewhere safe," Cole said, though his tone did little to reassure Ethan. The driver spoke up for the first time. "Safe is a relative term. They'll find us eventually." Cole shot her a sharp look. "We'll deal with that when it happens. Right now, we need time to regroup." Ethan glanced between them, his unease growing. These people might have saved him from the warehouse, but they weren't exactly filling him with confidence. As the van turned down a secluded dirt road, Ethan's mind raced with thoughts of Alexander. Had he made it out of the mansion safely? Was he even aware of what had happened? And what about Jackson and Mick? The guilt of leaving them behind gnawed at him. But Cole's warning echoed in his mind. Staying would have only put them all in more danger. The van came to a stop in front of a small cabin tucked deep in the woods. The place was unremarkable, its weathered exterior blending into the surrounding trees. Cole stepped out first, scanning the area before motioning for Ethan to follow. Inside, the cabin was sparse but functional. A single table with mismatched chairs, a couch that had seen better days, and a fireplace that provided the only source of warmth. The driver, who finally introduced herself as Lena, began unpacking supplies from a bag while Cole set up what looked like a portable communication device. Ethan stood awkwardly in the middle of the room, his exhaustion catching up with him. "So now what?" he asked, his voice heavy. Cole didn't look up from his work. "Now we figure out how to keep you alive long enough to find out what the Vipers really want." Before Ethan could respond, the device crackled to life. A distorted voice came through, barely audible over the static. "Cole, are you there? Do you copy?" Cole grabbed the receiver. "I'm here. What's the status?" The voice hesitated, and Ethan could hear faint sounds of shouting in the background. "It's bad. They've got eyes on Alexander. He's safe for now, but they're closing in. Ethan's stomach dropped. What? He's still in danger? Cole held up a hand to silence him. We'll handle it, he said into the receiver. Keep him moving and stay off the grid. I'll contact you with an update. As the communication cut off, Ethan's frustration boiled over. Handle it. You're just going to leave him out there? Cole turned to him, his expression hard. We don't have the manpower to protect everyone, kid. Right now, the best chance Alexander has is for us to figure out what the Vipers want and stop them before they strike again. Ethan clenched his fists, anger and helplessness swirling inside him. But before he could argue further, Lena spoke up from the corner of the room. We've got another problem, she said, holding up a tablet. The screen displayed a grainy surveillance feed of the cabin. Figures were moving through the trees, their dark shapes barely visible against the night. They found us. The air inside the cabin grew thick with tension as Cole and Lena exchanged urgent glances. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he peered over Lena's shoulder at the surveillance feed. Shadows crept closer, weaving between the trees like silent predators. He could see the unmistakable glint of weapons in their hands. Cole moved quickly, grabbing a rifle from a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards. Lena, get him to the back room, he ordered. His voice was low but steady, filled with the kind of authority that left no room for argument. No way, Ethan protested, his voice trembling. I'm not hiding while you fight them off. Cole shot him a glare. This isn't a debate. You're the reason they're here, and keeping you alive is our priority. Now move. Lena grabbed Ethan by the arm and dragged him toward a small room at the back of the cabin. He stumbled inside, the faint scent of damp wood filling his nostrils. The room was cramped, with only a narrow cot and a single shuttered window. Lena crouched by the door, her hand resting on the pistol holstered at her side. Outside, the night erupted into chaos. Gunshots echoed through the trees, sharp and deafening, mingling with shouted commands and the crunch of boots on dry leaves. Ethan pressed himself against the wall, his body trembling with fear and adrenaline. Through the small gap in the shutters, he caught a glimpse of Cole standing at the edge of the cabin, firing into the darkness. The muzzle flashes illuminated his grim expression, his every movement precise and calculated. But the attackers were relentless, their numbers overwhelming. Ethan could hear them getting closer, their voices growing louder. Cole can't hold them off forever, Lena muttered, mostly to herself. She turned to Ethan, her eyes filled with determination. If they breach the cabin, we'll have no choice but to fight. Are you ready for that? Ethan's throat was dry, his mind racing. He wasn't ready. He wasn't a fighter, but he nodded anyway, his fear giving way to a surge of resolve. He wasn't going to let these people, who had risked their lives to save him, go down without a fight. The sound of splintering wood sent a jolt of terror through him. The front door had been kicked in, and heavy footsteps thundered through the cabin. Ethan held his breath as Lena positioned herself behind the door, her pistol drawn. Suddenly, the door to their room burst open. A masked attacker stepped inside, his weapon raised. Before Ethan could react, Lena fired twice, the shots ringing out like thunder in the confined space. The man dropped to the floor, motionless. Ethan's ears rang, his chest heaving as he stared at the lifeless figure, but there was no time to process what had just happened. More footsteps approached, and Lena pulled Ethan toward the window. Out. Now, she barked, shoving him forward. Ethan hesitated for a split second before climbing through the window, his hands scraping against the rough wood. He landed hard on the ground outside, the cold air stinging his face. Lena followed close behind, her movements quick and practiced. They darted into the woods, the shouts and gunfire fading into the distance. Ethan's legs burned as he ran, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Lena stayed close, her eyes scanning their surroundings for any sign of pursuit. After what felt like an eternity, they reached a small clearing. Lena stopped, motioning for Ethan to crouch behind a fallen tree. She pressed a finger to her lips, signaling for silence. Ethan's chest heaved as he tried to quiet his breathing, his heart pounding like a drum. The silence stretched on, broken only by the distant sounds of the battle. But just as Ethan began to think they were safe, a figure stepped into the clearing. It was one of the attackers, his weapon trained on them. "End of the line," the man said, his voice cold. Lena raised her pistol, but the man was faster. He fired, the shot echoing through the clearing. Ethan froze, his mind screaming as Lena collapsed beside him, clutching her shoulder. The attacker took a step closer, his weapon still aimed. "You've caused a lot of trouble, kid," he said, his tone almost amused. "But this is where it ends." Ethan's eyes darted around the clearing, searching for anything he could use. His hand closed around a jagged rock, his fingers tightening around it. As the man raised his weapon to fire, Ethan lunged, swinging the rock with all his strength. The impact sent the man stumbling backward, his weapon clattering to the ground. Ethan didn't stop. He swung again and again, the adrenaline coursing through him, numbing his fear. Finally, the man fell silent, his body slumping to the ground. Ethan dropped the rock, his hands shaking as he looked at Lena. She was pale, her breathing shallow, but she managed a weak smile. "Not bad, kid," she whispered. Before Ethan could respond, a new sound filled the air, the distant whir of helicopter blades. He looked up, his heart sinking as a spotlight illuminated the clearing. But instead of more attackers, it was Alexander's voice that came over a loudspeaker. "Ethan, hold on, we're coming." Relief washed over Ethan as the helicopter descended, a team of armed guards spilling out to secure the area. Alexander himself stepped out moments later, his expression a mix of relief and concern. "You're alive," he said, pulling Ethan into a brief, fierce embrace. "I thought I'd lost you." Ethan's voice cracked as he replied, "I thought I'd lost you too." As the guards tended to Lena and secured the area, Ethan recounted everything that had happened. Alexander listened intently, his jaw tightening as Ethan described the attackers and their relentless pursuit. But just as the tension seemed to ease, one of the guards approached Alexander, his expression grim. "Sir, we found something you need to see." They led him to the body of the attacker Ethan had fought off. As Alexander crouched to inspect the man's belongings, his face darkened. He held up a small device, a tracker. "They've been following us the whole time," he said, his voice low. "And this is just the beginning." Ethan's stomach dropped as he realized the truth. The fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. The bustling streets of New York City were alive with the usual chaos of honking taxis, hurried footsteps, and the chatter of thousands of lives intertwining. Among the sea of faces, most people didn't notice the young boy standing near the corner of Fifth Avenue, his clothes torn and oversized, his face streaked with dirt. He was thin, far too thin for a boy his age, but his piercing green eyes were sharp, scanning the crowd as if searching for something or someone. His name was Ethan. At just 12 years old, he had already seen more hardship than most people could imagine. For weeks, he had been living on the streets, surviving on scraps and the occasional kind gesture of strangers. But today, something was different. There was an urgency in his stance, a determination that kept him rooted to that spot despite the freezing wind biting at his skin. A few feet away, a black limousine pulled up to the curb. The sleek vehicle was a stark contrast to the grime and despair of the city's underbelly. The door opened, and out stepped a man who exuded power and wealth. Dressed in a tailored suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, Alexander Monroe was every bit the billionaire mogul the tabloids loved to write about. Known for his shrewd business acumen and his seemingly endless fortune, Alexander was a man who had everything, except time for anyone outside his inner circle. As Alexander stepped onto the sidewalk, he barely glanced at the people around him. He was on his way to an exclusive charity gala at one of the city's most prestigious hotels. Ironically, the event was to raise money for homelessness, a cause Alexander supported more for the PR benefits than genuine concern. To him, people like Ethan were part of the background noise, an unfortunate reality he preferred to ignore. But fate had other plans that day. Ethan's sharp eyes locked onto the billionaire, and his heart began to race. He recognized Alexander immediately. His face was plastered on billboards and magazine covers all over the city. But Ethan wasn't interested in his wealth or fame. He had seen something far more important, something that made his stomach churn with fear. In Alexander's hand was a neatly wrapped sandwich, a quick snack his assistant had handed him moments before leaving the office. It was the kind of meal that someone like Alexander wouldn't think twice about, just another item on his endless list of conveniences. But to Ethan, it was a ticking time bomb. "Don't eat that," Ethan shouted, his voice cutting through the noise of the street like a siren. Heads turned as people paused to see where the outburst had come from. Alexander froze mid-step, his hand hovering near his mouth with the sandwich. He looked around, bewildered, until his eyes landed on the ragged boy running toward him. "Who are you?" Alexander demanded, his tone sharp and impatient. "What do you want?" "Please just don't eat it," Ethan gasped, his chest heaving as he came to a stop in front of the billionaire. "You can't. It's poisoned." The crowd around them murmured, a mix of curiosity and skepticism rippling through the air. Alexander's face hardened, his initial confusion giving way to irritation. "Poisoned," he scoffed. "What kind of ridiculous?" "I'm serious," Ethan interrupted, his voice desperate. "I saw the guy who gave it to you. He was acting weird, like he didn't want anyone to see. Please, you have to believe me." Alexander stared at the boy, his mind racing. It sounded absurd, like the plot of a bad thriller. But there was something in Ethan's eyes, a raw sincerity that made him hesitate. And then, as if on cue, his security team rushed over, forming a protective barrier around him. "Is everything all right, sir?" one of the guards asked, his hand hovering near his earpiece. Alexander hesitated, glancing between the sandwich and the boy. Logic told him to dismiss the claim as the ramblings of a street kid looking for attention, or maybe even money. But instinct told him something else. For the first time in years, Alexander felt a twinge of uncertainty, a crack in his otherwise impenetrable confidence. "Run a check," Alexander said finally, handing the sandwich to one of the guards, "just to be sure." The guard nodded and disappeared into the crowd, leaving Alexander and Ethan standing face to face. The boy's hands were trembling, but his gaze never wavered. "Thank you," Ethan whispered, relief flooding his voice. "Don't thank me yet," Alexander replied coldly. "If this is some kind of scam, you're going to regret it." Ethan didn't flinch. "It's not a scam. I swear." Minutes felt like hours as they waited for the guard to return. The crowd had grown, their curiosity morphing into speculation. Some whispered about the boy's courage, others questioned his motives. But Ethan didn't care. All he could think about was the man he had seen earlier, the one who had slipped away unnoticed, leaving behind a deadly secret. Finally, the guard returned, his expression grim. He leaned in to whisper something into Alexander's ear, and the billionaire's face darkened. He turned to Ethan, his piercing gaze suddenly filled with a mix of anger and disbelief. "You're coming with me," Alexander said, his voice low but commanding. "What? Why?" Ethan stammered, his eyes widening. "You clearly know more than you're letting on," Alexander replied, "and I want answers. Now." Before Ethan could protest, the security team ushered him toward the limousine. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the boy who had shouted the unthinkable was whisked away alongside one of the most powerful men in the city. As the car pulled into traffic, Alexander turned to Ethan, his expression unreadable. "Start talking," he said. "Who are you? And how did you know?" Ethan swallowed hard, his mind racing. He had just stepped into a world far more dangerous than he could have imagined, and there was no turning back now. The silence in the limousine was thick, almost suffocating. Ethan sat on the plush leather seat, his small frame dwarfed by the grandeur of the vehicle. His fingers fidgeted with the frayed edge of his jacket as he struggled to find the right words. Across from him, Alexander sat rigid, his intense gaze locked onto the boy. The weight of his presence was overwhelming, and Ethan could feel his heart pounding in his chest. "I asked you a question," Alexander said, his voice low and commanding. "Who are you, and how did you know the sandwich was poisoned?" Ethan hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. Trust was a luxury he couldn't afford, especially with someone like Alexander Monroe. "My name is Ethan," he began cautiously, his voice barely above a whisper. I live on the streets, or I guess you'd call it surviving. That doesn't answer my question. Alexander replied sharply. How did you know? Ethan's eyes darted to the window, where the city lights blurred into streaks of gold and white. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to meet Alexander's gaze. I saw the guy who gave it to you, he said. He wasn't just some delivery person. He was watching you, waiting to see if you'd eat it. Something about him felt wrong. Alexander studied the boy carefully, his mind racing. There was no way Ethan could have known about the sandwich unless he had truly seen something. But why would a homeless kid care enough to intervene? The pieces didn't add up, and Alexander hated not having answers. You expect me to believe that? Alexander said, leaning forward slightly. You just happened to notice someone acting off in a city full of suspicious people. I'm not lying. Ethan shot back, his voice cracking with desperation. I've been on the streets long enough to know when something's wrong. People like me, we have to notice things. It's the only way to stay alive. For a moment, Alexander didn't respond. He could see the fear in Ethan's eyes, but there was also a spark of defiance, a quiet strength that made him pause. The boy wasn't like the con artists or desperate opportunists Alexander had dealt with before. There was something genuine about him, something that made Alexander's instincts prick with curiosity. Fine, Alexander said finally, leaning back against the seat. Let's assume you're telling the truth. That still doesn't explain why you cared enough to warn me. What's in it for you? Ethan blinked, the question catching him off guard. He hadn't thought about it that way. I couldn't let you get hurt, he admitted, his voice softer now. I don't know why. Maybe it's because no one ever cared enough to warn me. The honesty in Ethan's words hit Alexander like a punch to the gut. For a man who prided himself on reading people, he found it unsettling how much this boy was throwing him off balance. But before he could respond, his phone buzzed, pulling his attention away. Alexander glanced at the screen. It was a message from his head of security. The lab results on the sandwich were in, and they confirmed Ethan's claim. Traces of a lethal toxin had been found, enough to kill someone within minutes. A cold shiver ran down Alexander's spine as he read the details. Someone had tried to assassinate him, and if it weren't for Ethan, they might have succeeded. He looked back at the boy, who was now staring at his lab, his shoulders slumped as if bracing for whatever came next. Alexander sighed, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. All right, Ethan, he said, his tone softer now. You saved my life. I owe you for that, but this isn't over. Whoever did this is still out there, and I need to find out why. Ethan's head shot up, his green eyes wide with a mix of fear and determination. You believe me? He asked, his voice tinged with surprise. I don't have a choice, Alexander replied. The poison was real, and if what you're saying is true, then you might have seen something that could help me figure out who's behind this. Ethan nodded slowly, though he still looked uneasy. I'll tell you what I know, he said. But I don't think it's much. I only saw the guy for a few seconds. He had a black hoodie, and he kept glancing around like he didn't want anyone to see his face. Did you see anything else? A tattoo? A scar? Anything distinctive? Alexander pressed. Ethan shook his head. No, but there was something about the way he walked. Like he was nervous, but trying to hide it. And when he handed off the sandwich, he muttered something under his breath. What did he say? Alexander asked, his interest piqued. Ethan frowned, trying to recall the moment. It sounded like, it's done. I think that's what he said. Alexander's jaw tightened. It wasn't much to go on, but it was a start. He pulled out his phone and sent a quick message to his security team, instructing them to comb through nearby surveillance footage for anyone matching Ethan's description. If there was one thing Alexander knew, it was that no one could hide in New York City for long, not with the resources he had at his disposal. As the limousine weaved through the streets, an uneasy silence settled between the two passengers. Ethan stared out the window, his mind racing with questions. What kind of world had he just stepped into? And why did he feel like he was in way over his head? Alexander, on the other hand, was wrestling with a different set of thoughts. He had always been a man who valued control, but tonight, Control had slipped through his fingers. Someone wanted him dead, and the only lead he had was a scrappy kid who had nothing to lose. The car came to a stop in front of a towering skyscraper, its sleek glass facade reflecting the city lights. "We're here," Alexander said, opening the door. "Come on." Ethan hesitated, looking up at the building with wide eyes. "Where are we?" "My office," Alexander replied. "It's the safest place for now." Ethan reluctantly followed, his worn sneakers squeaking against the polished marble floors as they entered the lobby. The space was a stark contrast to the world Ethan was used to: gleaming surfaces, spotless decor, and an air of quiet efficiency. He felt out of place, like an intruder in a world that didn't belong to him. They rode the elevator in silence, the numbers climbing higher and higher until they reached the top floor. The doors opened to reveal a sprawling office with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking view of the city. Ethan's eyes widened as he took it all in: the modern furniture, the high-tech gadgets, the sheer opulence of it all.